Sarah Mitchell pressed her back against the cold concrete wall of the second-floor stairwell, her breathing controlled and silent as she listened to the heavy footsteps echoing through the hallway below. In her left hand, she held a chemistry textbook. In her right, she gripped the emergency fire axe she'd pulled from the wall display case 30 seconds earlier. What the students hiding in classroom 247 didn't know was that their quiet substitute teacher had just calculated 17 different angles of approach, identified 3 potential escape routes, and was preparing to neutralize an armed intruder using skills that hadn't appeared on any job application Riverside High School had ever seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The man stalking through their hallways had no idea that the harmless substitute he'd dismissed during his initial sweep was actually Sarah "Ghost" Mitchell, former Army Special Operations sniper with 47 confirmed eliminations and a Congressional Medal of Honor gathering dust in a storage unit across town. For 6 months, she'd graded papers and managed study halls while everyone assumed she was just another temporary teacher filling gaps in the schedule. Now, with 47 students and 8 staff members trapped inside the building, those assumptions were about to prove deadly wrong. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune above the rows of empty desks in classroom 118, where Sarah Mitchell sat hunched over a stack of essays about the American Civil War. Red ink flowed from her pen in careful corrections, marking grammatical errors and suggesting improvements to arguments about military strategy that these high school juniors barely understood. Outside the windows of Riverside High School, the October afternoon painted the Rocky Mountain foothills in shades of gold and amber, but Sarah's attention remained fixed on papers that would be returned to students who probably wouldn't read her comments anyway. She glanced at the clock mounted above the whiteboard. 2:45. The final bell had rung 15 minutes ago, sending most students streaming toward the parking lot or loading onto yellow buses that would carry them back to their comfortable homes in Cedar Falls, Montana. Sarah preferred these quiet moments. After the chaos subsided, when the hallways emptied and she could work without interruption. As a substitute teacher, she rarely had a classroom to call her own, bouncing between assignments whenever regular faculty called in sick or needed coverage. For conferences and training days, the door to 118 creaked open, and Brad Morrison stuck his head inside. The pay teacher's muscular frame filled the doorway as he surveyed the scene with barely concealed amusement. His varsity jacket bore the Riverside Eagles logo, and his whistle hung around his neck like a badge of authority that he wore even during non-athletic hours. "Still here, Mitchell?" Brad's voice carried that familiar tone of condescension that seemed to follow substitute teachers wherever they went. "Don't you know the school day ends when the kids leave? No need to win any dedication awards around here." Sarah looked up from the essay she'd been reading, her expression neutral and professional. "Just finishing up some grading. These students deserve quality feedback on their work." Brad chuckled and shook his head. "You substitutes kill me. Acting like you're real teachers when everyone knows you'll be gone next week when something better comes along. Save yourself the effort. Half these kids won't even read what you write anyway." The comment stung, though Sarah kept her face carefully composed. She'd heard variations of the same dismissive attitude from permanent faculty members ever since she'd started working at Riverside 6 months ago. To them, she was temporary help, a warm body to fill space and keep students quiet until the real teacher returned. They had no idea that she possessed more leadership experience and crisis management training than the entire administrative staff combined. "I think you'd be surprised what students appreciate when someone takes them seriously," Sarah replied, setting down her pen and meeting Brad's gaze directly. "These essays show real insight into military tactics and strategic thinking. Some Of these kids have natural analytical abilities that could take them far if properly developed. Brad laughed outright at that. Military tactics? Sarah, they're high school juniors writing about a war that ended over 150 years ago. Don't read too much into their copy and paste jobs from Wikipedia. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He glanced at his watch and stepped back into the hallway. Anyway, don't stay too late. Building gets locked up at 6, and maintenance doesn't like finding stragglers. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the stack of papers that suddenly felt heavier than before. She returned to her grading, but Brad's words echoed in her mind. The assumption that substitute teachers were inherently less capable, less committed, less worthy of respect had become a constant undercurrent in her daily interactions. Regular faculty spoke around her rather than to her during staff meetings. Students tested boundaries more aggressively when they saw her name on the board instead of their regular teachers. Parents complained more frequently about assignments and policies when they discovered their child was being taught by just a substitute. What none of them knew was that Sarah Mitchell had commanded respect from some of the most elite soldiers in the United States military. For 8 years, she'd led reconnaissance missions through hostile territory, where a single mistake could mean death for her entire team. She'd made split-second decisions that saved civilian lives and eliminated threats to national security. Her marksmanship skills had earned her a reputation as one of the most precise shooters in special operations, capable of making shots that other snipers declared impossible. But those accomplishments existed in a world that felt increasingly distant from the quiet hallways of Riverside High School. Here, her greatest challenges involved managing rowdy study halls and explaining why late assignments wouldn't be accepted. The skills that had once made her invaluable to military operations seemed completely irrelevant in an environment where success was measured by standardized test scores and parent satisfaction surveys. Sarah picked up another essay, this one, written by Emma Chun, one of her brightest students. Emma's analysis of Civil War battlefield tactics demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of terrain advantages and supply line vulnerabilities that impressed Sarah with its insight. The girl had a natural grasp of strategic thinking that reminded Sarah of briefings she'd attended in military planning rooms. Emma's writing showed the kind of analytical mind that could excel in intelligence work or military strategy, but Sarah doubted anyone else would recognize that potential in a high school English assignment. The sound of footsteps in the hallway caught her attention. Heavy, deliberate steps that didn't match the usual patterns of students heading to after-school activities or teachers leaving for the day. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, her senses sharpening as she identified the rhythm and weight of the movement. 3 individuals moving with purpose rather than casual direction. Something about their approach triggered instincts that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. She set down her pen and moved quietly to the window that looked out into the main hallway. Through the small glass panel, she could see 3 figures dressed in dark clothing, their faces partially obscured by baseball caps pulled low. The man in the lead was tall and heavily built, his movements suggesting familiarity with violence. Sarah's trained eye immediately cataloged details, the way he scanned doorways, the bulge under his jacket that indicated a concealed weapon, the careful positioning that kept his companions in supporting roles. This wasn't a group of students staying late for club activities. This wasn't maintenance staff or evening custodial workers. Sarah's military experience screamed danger as she watched the 3 figures move methodically down the hallway, checking door handles and peering into empty classrooms. They were searching for something or someone, and their presence in the building after hours violated every security protocol that should have been in place. Sarah's mind instantly shifted into tactical mode, her civilian persona falling away. as 8 years of special operations training took control. She needed information. How many people were still in the building? What were the intruders' objectives? What weapons did they possess? What escape routes were available? The questions flowed through her consciousness in the prioritized sequence she'd learned during countless mission briefings. Moving with the silent precision that had earned her the nickname Ghost during her military service, Sarah crept to the classroom door and listened carefully. The footsteps had stopped somewhere near the main office, and she could hear muffled voices discussing building layout and security measures. Fragments of conversation drifted through the hallway, confirming her worst fears about their intentions. "Check the after-school programs," a gravelly voice commanded. "Basketball practice should be wrapping up in the gym. Drama club meets in the auditorium on Fridays. Find out who's still here and get them together." "What about staff?" a younger voice asked. "Parking lot still has about a dozen cars. Teachers, administrators, custodial workers, doesn't matter," the leader replied. "Anyone still in the building becomes part of the equation. This needs to be clean and controlled." Sarah's blood chilled as she processed the implications. This wasn't a random break-in or vandalism incident. The intruders had planned their timing to coincide with after-school activities, when the building would have fewer people but still contain enough potential hostages to complicate any law enforcement response. They'd studied the school's schedule and security procedures, suggesting advanced surveillance and preparation. Her hand instinctively reached for the tactical radio that should have been clipped to her belt, but found only the fabric of her civilian teaching clothes. She wasn't carrying military equipment or weapons. She didn't have direct communication with law enforcement or backup support. For the first time in 6 months, Sarah Mitchell was facing a genuine crisis, and she was equipped with nothing more than red pens and lesson plans. The realization forced her to confront the gulf between her current identity and her former capabilities. As Ghost Mitchell, she would have already established communication with her team, identified primary and secondary objectives, and begun implementing tactical responses based on established protocols. But as Sarah, the substitute teacher, she was expected to be helpless, to hide in a locked classroom and wait for authorities to resolve the situation. Except that Sarah knew exactly how long it would take for help to arrive in Cedar Falls, Montana. The sheriff's department was undermanned and located 20 minutes away from the school. State police were even further out. By the time qualified law enforcement reached Riverside High School, whatever the intruders planned to accomplish would already be finished. She moved back to her desk and quietly opened her laptop, accessing the school's emergency communication system. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she composed a message to the main office, then stopped. If the intruders had reached the administrative wing, they might already have control of the building's communication systems. Sending an electronic alert could reveal her location and compromise her ability to help others. Instead, Sarah opened her email and composed a message to the county sheriff's office, providing precise details about the number of intruders, their apparent weapons, and their current position within the building. She included information about students and staff who might still be on campus, estimating approximately 47 students participating in various after-school activities and 8 faculty or staff members who typically remained late on Friday afternoons. As she typed, Sarah's military training automatically began formulating tactical assessments. The school's layout provided multiple entry and exit points, but also created choke points that could be used defensively. The 2-story main building connected to the gymnasium and auditorium through covered walkways that could become danger zones if the intruders controlled them. Emergency exits were clearly marked and regularly maintained, but would be vulnerable to monitoring by anyone who understood basic security principles. The sound of footsteps returned, closer now and moving with more urgency. Sarah saved her email to drafts and quietly closed the laptop. Whatever message she'd been preparing would have to wait. The immediate priority was gathering intelligence about the intruder's numbers, weapons, and objectives while avoiding detection that could compromise her ability to assist others. She gathered the essays she'd been grading and stuffed them into her bag, creating the appearance of a teacher preparing to leave for the weekend. If discovered, she needed to seem like nothing more than what everyone expected, a substitute teacher finishing her work and heading home. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same assumptions that had frustrated her for months might now prove crucial for survival. Sarah checked her watch, 3:15. The intruders had been in the building for approximately 10 minutes, long enough to establish control over key areas, but not long enough to have completed a thorough sweep of all rooms and spaces. Students in after-school activities might not yet realize the danger, depending on how isolated their locations were from the main administrative areas. Moving to the classroom's second window, Sarah surveyed the parking lot and surrounding grounds. No signs of law enforcement vehicles or emergency responders. The sheriff's department either hadn't received her email yet or was still en route. She was operating in the critical window where trained intervention could make the difference between a contained incident and a major tragedy. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like familiar equipment from her military days. For 6 months, Sarah Mitchell had been content to remain invisible, to accept the limitations and dismissals that came with being just a substitute teacher. But faced with genuine danger to students and colleagues who had no idea how to protect themselves, she found herself unable to maintain that comfortable anonymity. Her hands moved automatically to check for gear that wasn't there. Tactical. Knife, communication equipment, backup weapon, emergency medical supplies. Instead, she inventoried what was available in a typical high school classroom: fire extinguisher, emergency radio, first aid kit, and various improvised weapons if the situation demanded them. It wasn't much, but Sarah had learned to work with limited resources in environments far more hostile than suburban Montana. The footsteps were getting closer again, accompanied by voices that carried the confidence of people who believed they controlled the situation. Sarah could hear them testing door handles and briefly entering rooms to ensure they were empty. They were being thorough and methodical, suggesting military or law enforcement training that made them more dangerous than common criminals. Time was running out for gathering intelligence safely. Soon, the intruders would reach her corridor and discover her presence. Sarah needed to make a decision that would define not only her own survival, but potentially the lives of dozens of people who had no idea they were in danger. She could remain hidden, following the protocol that expected civilians to avoid confrontation and wait for professional help. Or she could acknowledge that sometimes professional help arrived too late, and that the person everyone overlooked might be exactly the person who could see solutions that others couldn't. Sarah Mitchell looked around the classroom one final time, seeing it now not as a place of quiet grading and mundane responsibilities, but as a tactical position in a larger battlefield where the stakes were measured in human lives rather than test scores. The substitute teacher who had been dismissed and underestimated for 6 months was about to discover whether 8 years of special operations training could translate into saving the lives of people who had never bothered to learn her real name. The decision crystallized in Sarah's mind with the clarity that had once guided her through mission-critical moments in Afghanistan and Iraq. She couldn't remain passive while innocent people faced danger from trained adversaries who clearly understood tactical operations. Moving with the fluid silence that had become second nature during 8 years of special operations, she slipped from the classroom and into the main hallway, her senses hyper-alert to every sound and movement in the building around her. Familiar corridors of Riverside High School transformed in her perception. No longer mundane educational spaces, but potential battleground terrain requiring careful navigation. Sarah's eyes automatically cataloged defensive positions, concealment opportunities, and sightlines that could provide tactical advantages. The trophy cases that normally displayed decades of Eagles' athletic achievements now represented potential sources of improvised weapons. The intersecting hallways that students navigated daily between classes became choke points that could channel movement or create ambush opportunities. She pressed herself against the wall adjacent to the main stairwell, listening intently to the voices echoing from the administrative wing. The conversation was becoming clearer as the intruders established their positions and began coordinating their next phase of operations. Sarah's training allowed her to distinguish between individual speakers and analyze their communication patterns for clues about their backgrounds and objectives. Jim's clear, except for basketball team, reported a voice she hadn't heard before, suggesting at least 4 individuals rather than the 3 she'd initially observed. Coach Henderson's with them. That's 15 kids plus 1 adult. Drama. Rehearsals got about 12 more in the auditorium, added another speaker. Teacher named Collins is supervising. They're running through some scenes for next week's performance. Sarah's mental count was reaching dangerous numbers. If the intruders were conducting a systematic sweep of after-school activities, they were potentially gathering close to 30 students plus several faculty members. The basketball team alone represented some of Riverside's most prominent student athletes, kids whose families formed the core of Cedar Falls' social and economic leadership. Whatever the intruders planned, they were creating a hostage situation that would attract significant attention from law enforcement and media. The leader's voice cut through the updates with cold authority. Bring them all to the cafeteria. That space gives us good sight lines and limited entry points. We can control everyone from there while we wait for our window. The term suggested this wasn't a random act of violence, but a carefully timed operation designed to coincide with specific external events. Sarah's strategic mind immediately began analyzing possibilities. Friday afternoon timing could relate to weekend security schedules, shift changes in law enforcement coverage, or coordination with other activities that would delay response times. The methodical approach indicated advanced planning and possibly inside knowledge of school procedures. Moving carefully along the wall, Sarah reached the intersection that led toward the library wing. Her instincts urged her to gather more intelligence before taking any direct action, but she also recognized that time was working against both the potential hostages and any rescue operations. Every minute that passed allowed the intruders to consolidate their control and prepare for an inevitable law enforcement response. The library door stood slightly ajar, and Sarah could see movement inside. Linda Rodriguez, the head librarian, was apparently still on campus, probably working late on weekend preparations or catching up on administrative tasks. Linda had been one of the few faculty members who treated Sarah with genuine respect, engaging her in conversations about literature and educational philosophy during brief encounters in the faculty lounge. Now that kindness might place Linda directly in the path of armed intruders who were systematically clearing the building. Sarah faced a tactical dilemma that her military training had prepared her for, but hoped she'd never encounter in civilian life. She could attempt to warn Linda and help her escape, but doing so might reveal Sarah's presence and compromise her ability to gather intelligence or assist others. Alternatively, she could maintain her concealment and continue reconnaissance, gambling that Linda would remain undetected until Sarah could formulate a more comprehensive response plan. The choice was made for her when footsteps approached the library from the opposite direction. One of the intruders was conducting room-by-room searches, and Linda Rodriguez was about to discover that her quiet Friday afternoon had become something far more dangerous than overdue book returns and weekend reading programs. Sarah moved swiftly but silently through the library entrance, using her knowledge of the space to navigate between stacks, without creating any sound that might alert the approaching intruder. She found Linda at the circulation desk, absorbed in cataloging new acquisitions and completely unaware of the danger approaching from the main hallway. "Linda, Sarah whispered urgently, causing the librarian to look up in surprise. "We have a serious problem. Armed intruders are in the building, and they're gathering everyone in the cafeteria. You need to come with me right now." Linda Rodriguez stared at Sarah with the expression of someone processing information that didn't fit her normal reality. As head librarian, Linda was accustomed to handling student disciplinary issues, budget constraints, and administrative paperwork, not emergency situations involving armed threats. Her initial reaction was skepticism rather than immediate compliance. "Sarah, what are you talking about? Armed intruders? This is Cedar Falls, not some urban war zone. Are you sure you're not misunderstanding something you saw?" The sound of approaching footsteps eliminated any opportunity for extended explanation. Sarah grabbed Linda's arm and pulled her toward the library's rear exit, the emergency door that led to the science wing corridor. Her military training screamed at her to move faster, but she couldn't abandon Linda to face the intruders alone, regardless of the librarian's initial disbelief. They reached the emergency exit just as the main library door opened fully, admitting a figure in dark clothing who immediately began systematically searching the space. Sarah pressed herself and Linda against the wall beside the rear door, both women holding their breath as they listened to the intruder moving methodically through the book stacks, checking potential hiding places with the thoroughness of someone who understood building searches. Through the small window in the emergency door, Sarah could observe the science wing hallway, which appeared empty but offered a route toward the building's perimeter exits. However, leaving the building entirely would mean abandoning the students and faculty who were being gathered in the cafeteria, people who had no idea they were facing trained adversaries rather than common criminals. "Is there anyone else still in the building that you know about?" Sarah whispered to Linda, her voice barely audible but urgent with the need for accurate intelligence. Linda's face had gone pale as the reality of their situation penetrated her initial skepticism. The sound of someone systematically searching the library had convinced her that Sarah's warning was genuine, and her mind was now racing through the implications of armed intruders in her workplace. "The basketball team was practicing when I came in here an hour ago," Linda whispered back. "Drama club had rehearsal scheduled until 4. Tom Jackson was staying late to work on lesson plans for next week. Maybe some custodial staff, but I'm not sure about their Friday schedule." The information confirmed Sarah's earlier intelligence gathering, but also highlighted the scope of the potential hostage situation. Basketball practice typically involved 15 to 20 students plus coach and staff. Drama rehearsal could include another dozen participants. Faculty members like Tom Jackson, who served as the English department head, represented the kind of high-profile hostages that would complicate any law enforcement response. Sarah's strategic assessment of the situation was becoming increasingly grim. The intruders had chosen their timing perfectly, arriving when the building contained enough people to create a significant hostage situation, but few enough to maintain control without overwhelming their resources. The systematic search pattern suggested military or law enforcement training, indicating they would be prepared for standard police response protocols. The sound of footsteps in the library was moving closer to their position. Within moments, the intruder would reach the rear section where emergency exits provided the only escape routes from the building. Sarah made a rapid tactical decision based on terrain analysis and available options for movement. "When I open this door, we're going to move quickly and quietly to the right, toward the chemistry lab," she instructed Linda in a whisper that barely disturbed the air between them. "Stay directly behind me, step exactly where I step, and don't make any sound until we're inside the lab." Linda nodded, her trust in Sarah's judgment apparently strengthened by the substitute teacher's confident demeanor and precise instructions. For 6 months, Linda had observed Sarah managing difficult students and complicated situations with unusual calm and competence. Now she was seeing an entirely different side of the woman she'd considered a temporary colleague. Sarah opened the emergency door with practiced care, ensuring the mechanism engaged silently and didn't trigger any alarm systems that might alert the intruders to their movement. The science wing corridor stretched ahead of them, its fluorescent lighting creating pools of illumination separated by shadows that could provide concealment during their advance toward the chemistry lab. They moved with careful coordination, Sarah's military training guiding their pace and positioning, while Linda followed with the trust of someone who recognized expertise even when she didn't fully understand its source. The chemistry lab door was unlocked, typical for after-school hours when teachers often returned to prepare materials for the following week's experiments. Once inside the lab, Sarah immediately moved to secure their position, checking sight lines through the windows and identifying secondary exit routes if their location became compromised. The chemistry lab occupied a corner position in the science wing, providing windows that overlooked both the student parking lot and the access road that emergency vehicles would use when responding to the crisis. "Sarah, how do you know all this stuff?" Linda asked quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. "You're handling this like you've been trained for emergency situations. That's not exactly typical preparation for substitute teaching." The question forced Sarah to confront the gap between her public identity and her actual background, a conversation she'd been avoiding for 6 months while trying to blend into the civilian world of educational work. Her military service had ended with an honorable discharge following an injury that ended her field operations career, but left her with skills and knowledge that seemed irrelevant to classroom management and lesson planning. "I had some training before I became a teacher," Sarah replied carefully, focusing her attention on observing the parking lot for signs of law enforcement response. "Right now, the important thing is figuring out how to help the people who are being gathered in the cafeteria." Through the chemistry lab windows, Sarah could see the first emergency vehicles arriving in the school parking lot. Sheriff's Department. Patrol cars were establishing a perimeter around the building, their red and blue lights creating a strobing pattern against the afternoon shadows. The response was faster than she'd expected, suggesting her email had reached the appropriate authorities and triggered immediate deployment of available resources. But Sarah's military experience also told her that the initial law enforcement response would follow standard protocols designed for common criminal situations rather than tactical operations involving trained adversaries. The sheriff's deputies would establish a perimeter, attempt communication with the intruders, and call for specialized support that might take hours to arrive in rural Montana. Meanwhile, the hostages in the cafeteria were facing unknown dangers from adversaries who had demonstrated advanced planning and operational sophistication. Sarah knew that conventional law enforcement approaches might escalate the situation in ways that endangered innocent lives, particularly if the intruders possessed military training comparable to her own. "Linda, I need you to stay here and monitor police communications if you can," Sarah said, making a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "There's a police scanner app on most smartphones. Try to find out what kind of response they're planning and how long it might take for tactical units to arrive." Linda stared at her with growing alarm. "Where are you going?" "Sarah, you can't possibly be thinking of doing something dangerous. You're a substitute teacher, not a police officer or military person." The comment highlighted the fundamental misunderstanding that had defined Sarah's civilian life for the past 6 months. Everyone who knew her at Riverside High School saw exactly what she'd allowed them to see: a quiet, competent substitute teacher who managed classrooms effectively and graded papers thoroughly. None of them suspected that she possessed training and experience that exceeded most law enforcement officers and rivaled many military specialists. "I'm going to gather more intelligence about what we're dealing with," Sarah replied, checking her watch and calculating time factors that would affect both hostage safety and rescue operations. The police response is going to take time to organize properly, and every minute those people spend with armed intruders increases the danger they're facing. She moved toward the chemistry lab's secondary exit, the door that led to the outdoor corridor connecting the science wing to the main building. Her plan was forming based on tactical principles she'd learned during countless mission briefings: gather intelligence, assess enemy capabilities, identify weaknesses in their positioning, and look for opportunities to assist without compromising overall security. But Linda's question echoed in her mind as she prepared to leave the relative safety of the chemistry lab. Who was Sarah Mitchell, really? For 8 years, she'd been Staff Sergeant Sarah "Ghost" Mitchell, a special operations sniper whose precision and tactical judgment had saved lives and eliminated threats in some of the world's most dangerous environments. Her military record included commendations for valor, innovative tactical thinking, and leadership under extreme pressure. Then an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan had ended her field career, leaving her with injuries that healed but memories that remained vivid. The transition to civilian life had been more difficult than she'd anticipated, particularly finding work that utilized her skills without constantly reminding her of experiences she was trying to process. Substitute teaching had seemed like a safe haven, a way to contribute to society while maintaining the anonymity that helped her cope with post-military adjustment. Now, faced with a crisis that demanded exactly the skills she'd been trying to forget, Sarah found herself caught between the identity she'd constructed and the person she'd actually been trained to be. The students and faculty, trapped in the cafeteria, didn't know that their harmless substitute teacher possessed capabilities that might make the difference between survival and tragedy. Moving carefully through the outdoor corridor, Sarah used her knowledge of the building's layout to approach the main structure from an angle that wouldn't be covered by standard security positions. The intruders had probably established observation posts that monitored obvious approaches, but her military training had taught her to identify routes that avoided predictable sight lines. The afternoon air carried the sound of police radios and emergency vehicle engines, creating an auditory backdrop that would mask small movements if she remained careful about noise discipline. Through windows, she could observe law enforcement officers establishing their command post in the parking lot, setting up the kind of perimeter that would contain the situation but couldn't immediately resolve it. Sarah reached a position that allowed her to observe the cafeteria through exterior windows, and what she saw confirmed her worst fears about the tactical sophistication of the intruders. They had positioned themselves to control all entrances to the large space, while maintaining sightlines that prevented any surprise approach by law enforcement. The hostages were gathered in the center of the room, far enough from walls and exits to eliminate any possibility of quick escape. More significantly, Sarah could see that the intruders were using military-style communication equipment and had posted sentries that suggested formal tactical training. This wasn't a desperate criminal act or random violence, but a planned operation, conducted by people who understood security procedures and law enforcement response protocols. Her count of visible hostages confirmed approximately 30 students and at least 6 adults, including faculty members she recognized in support, staff who had been caught in the building when the operation began. Among the students, she could identify several of her own former pupils, kids who had tested her patience during difficult substitute assignments, but who certainly didn't deserve to face armed hosters. Emma Chun sat with a group of drama club members, her usually confident demeanor replaced by the fearful uncertainty that affected everyone in the cafeteria. Tyler Brooks, a troubled student who had gradually opened up during Sarah's supervision of study halls, was positioned with the basketball team, his athletic build meaningless against armed adversaries who controlled the situation through superior positioning and weapons. The sight of these young people in danger triggered something deeper than professional training in Sarah's consciousness. For 6 months, she'd maintained careful emotional distance from her students, treating them as temporary assignments rather than individuals who mattered to her personally. But seeing them faced with genuine danger stripped away the protective detachment she'd cultivated. These weren't abstract hostages in a tactical scenario. They were Emma, who wrote insightful essays about military strategy, and Tyler, who struggled with family problems but showed genuine intelligence when given proper attention. They were Linda Rodriguez, who had treated Sarah with kindness when others saw only a temporary employee, and Tom Jackson, whose dedication to teaching reminded Sarah why education mattered. Sarah found herself facing the same moral clarity that had defined her most difficult military decisions. She possessed skills and knowledge that could potentially save lives, but using them would require abandoning the careful anonymity she'd maintained, and accepting risks that could result in her own death or the deaths of people she was trying to protect. The sound of approaching sirens indicated that additional law enforcement resources were arriving, but Sarah's tactical assessment suggested they would face the same limitations that affected the initial response. Standard police procedures were designed for containment and negotiation, approaches that worked well against common criminals, but might prove inadequate against adversaries with military training and advanced preparation. Through her concealed observation position, Sarah could see one of the intruders speaking into a radio device, apparently coordinating with external contacts or monitoring law enforcement communications. The professional manner of his communication suggested this operation was part of a larger plan that extended beyond the immediate hostage situation. Time was becoming a critical factor in ways that the gathering law enforcement response probably didn't fully understand. If the intruders were operating according to a predetermined timeline, they might escalate their actions based on external triggers rather than negotiation progress. Sarah's military experience had taught her that tactical situations could deteriorate rapidly when adversaries possessed operational plans that didn't depend on local outcomes. The choice she faced was becoming unavoidable. She could remain hidden and hope that conventional law enforcement response would succeed without casualties, or she could acknowledge that sometimes the person everyone overlooked was exactly the person who could see solutions that others couldn't perceive. Sarah Mitchell, substitute teacher and former special operations sniper, checked her improvised equipment one final time and prepared to discover whether 8 years of military training could translate into saving the lives of people who had no idea that their quiet colleague possessed skills that hadn't appeared on any employment application Riverside High School had ever reviewed. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow as she crouched in the shadows outside the cafeteria windows, watching the hostage situation unfold with the clinical detachment that 8 years of special operations had drilled into her consciousness. She wasn't just observing a crisis anymore. She was analyzing a tactical scenario that matched situations she'd faced in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, where American lives hung in the balance and conventional responses had proven inadequate for complex threat environments. The lead intruder moved with the fluid precision of someone who had received advanced military training, his positioning and communication patterns revealing a background that probably included special forces or elite law enforcement experience. Sarah's trained eye cataloged the subtle indicators, the way he maintained sightlines while communicating, his systematic approach to controlling the space, and the professional manner in which he coordinated with his team members positioned throughout the building. This wasn't random violence or desperate criminal behavior. This was a military-style operation conducted by adversaries who understood tactical principles as well as she did, which meant conventional law enforcement response would face challenges that small-town sheriff departments were never designed to handle. The hostages weren't just in danger. They were trapped in a scenario that required expertise most people didn't possess and solutions that existed outside standard emergency response protocols. Through the cafeteria windows, Sarah could see Dr. Robert Hayes, the school principal, attempting to maintain calm among the frightened students and faculty. Hayes was a good administrator who managed budgets and educational policies effectively, but his leadership experience hadn't prepared him for armed hostage situations involving trained adversaries. His attempts to reassure the hostages were well-intentioned but tactically naive, potentially interfering with whatever plans the intruders were implementing. The sight of Hayes trying to negotiate with armed professionals triggered memories of similar situations Sarah had witnessed in combat zones, where civilian authority figures found themselves facing threats that exceeded their comprehension and training. Good intentions meant nothing against adversaries who operated according to military principles and tactical objectives that civilian leadership couldn't anticipate or counter effectively. But what troubled Sarah most deeply was the recognition that she possessed knowledge and capabilities that could potentially change the outcome of this crisis, skills that remained completely unknown to everyone who might benefit from them. For 6 months, she had carefully constructed an identity as an unremarkable substitute teacher, someone who blended into the background and avoided attention that might lead to uncomfortable questions about her past. That anonymity had been a form of protection, allowing her to process her transition from military service to civilian life without constantly confronting the gap between her former capabilities and her current role. Teaching high school students about Civil War battles felt safe compared to eliminating threats in active combat zones, even when the work seemed mundane compared to the intensity and importance of her previous assignments. Now watching 30 innocent people face trained adversaries who could escalate the situation into a tragedy within minutes, Sarah confronted the moral weight of keeping her expertise hidden. She was probably the only person within miles who possessed the tactical knowledge needed to assess this threat accurately and potentially neutralize it before law enforcement response could organize effectively. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Sheriff Department response time from Cedar Falls to Riverside High School was approximately 20 minutes under optimal conditions. Tactical units would require additional time to assess the situation, establish communication protocols, and coordinate with federal authorities who might have jurisdiction over incidents involving potential domestic terrorism. Meanwhile, the intruders were operating according to a timeline that probably didn't allow for extended negotiation or gradual escalation. Sarah's analysis of their positioning and communication patterns suggested they were preparing for a specific action that would occur regardless of law enforcement response, which meant the hostages faced immediate danger that conventional protocols couldn't address quickly enough. She moved carefully around the building's perimeter, using her knowledge of sightlines and concealment opportunities to gather more comprehensive intelligence about the intruders, deployment, and objectives. The systematic nature of their operation became more apparent as she observed their coordination and communication patterns from multiple angles. One intruder remained positioned in the main administrative wing, controlling access to communication systems and monitoring law enforcement response through windows that overlooked the parking lot. Another had established an observation post in the second-floor science wing, providing elevated sightlines that covered most approaches to the building. The third visible team member maintained mobile patrol status, moving between positions to ensure no areas remained unmonitored for extended periods. The deployment pattern was sophisticated and professional, indicating advanced planning that included detailed knowledge of the building's layout and security vulnerabilities. More concerning was the evidence that they possessed communication equipment that allowed coordination with external contacts, suggesting this operation was part of a larger plan rather than an isolated incident. Sarah's strategic analysis identified several critical factors that conventional law enforcement response might not recognize immediately. The intruders had positioned themselves to control all obvious entry points while maintaining communication with outside contacts who could provide tactical intelligence about police response. They had gathered hostages in a location that provided excellent defensive positioning while limiting rescue options that might endanger innocent lives. Most significantly, their timing suggested coordination with external factors that created pressure for rapid resolution rather than extended negotiation. Friday afternoon timing could relate to weekend security schedules, but it might also correspond to other events that would complicate law enforcement response or create additional pressures for swift action. The sound of additional sirens indicated that state police resources were arriving to supplement local sheriff department capabilities, but Sarah's military experience told her that tactical response would still require significant time to organize properly. Specialized units would need to travel from urban areas that were hours away from Cedar Falls, during which time the hostages remained vulnerable to escalation that could occur at any moment. Through her concealed observation position, Sarah could see Emma Chun attempting to comfort younger students who were crying from fear and confusion. Emma's natural leadership qualities were evident even in this terrifying situation, as she organized the drama club members into a supportive group that helped maintain calm among the most frightened hostages. Tyler Brooks sat with the basketball team, his athletic training apparent in the way he remained alert and ready to respond if opportunities for action arose. But Sarah could also see the helpless frustration in his posture, the recognition that physical fitness meant nothing against armed adversaries who controlled the situation through superior positioning and weapons. Linda Rodriguez had apparently been discovered during the systematic building search and was now seated with other faculty members in the cafeteria, her earlier escape from the library having provided only temporary safety. The sight of Linda among the hostages eliminated any remaining doubt about Sarah's moral obligations in this situation. These weren't abstract victims in a tactical scenario. They were people she knew and cared about, individuals who had shown her kindness during her difficult transition to civilian life. Linda had treated her with genuine respect when others saw only a temporary employee. Emma had submitted thoughtful essays that demonstrated real intellectual curiosity. Tyler had gradually opened up during study halls, revealing intelligence and sensitivity beneath his troubled exterior. The personal connections transformed Sarah's analysis from professional assessment to moral imperative. She possessed skills that could potentially save the lives of people who mattered to her, but using those skills would require abandoning the careful anonymity that had protected her emotional equilibrium for 6 months. More critically, taking action would mean accepting responsibility for outcomes that could include not only her own death, but potentially the deaths of people she was trying to protect. Military operations always involved calculated risks, but those calculations became infinitely more complex when the stakes included civilians she knew personally rather than abstract strategic objectives. The radio communication she could observe through the cafeteria windows indicated that the intruders were receiving updates from external contacts, possibly including intelligence about law enforcement response that would allow them to maintain tactical advantages. Their professional approach to the hostage situation suggested they were prepared for police response and had planned countermeasures that would complicate rescue attempts. Sarah's assessment of the law enforcement response, visible in the parking lot, confirmed her concerns about conventional approaches to this crisis. Sheriff Department personnel were establishing perimeters and communication protocols that worked well for typical criminal situations, but might prove inadequate against adversaries with military training and advanced preparation. The tactical reality was becoming unavoidable. She was probably the only person in immediate proximity who possessed the expertise needed to assess this threat accurately and potentially neutralize it before conventional response could organize effectively. Her special operations background included training in hostage rescue operations, building assault techniques, and precision engagement of armed targets in complex environments. But acknowledging her capabilities would mean confronting the fundamental question that had haunted her transition to civilian life. Who was Sarah Mitchell really? Was she the quiet substitute teacher who graded papers and managed study halls? Or was she Staff Sergeant Sarah "Ghost" Mitchell, whose tactical judgment and marksmanship skills had saved American lives in some of the world's most dangerous locations? The artificial separation she'd maintained between her military identity and her civilian persona was collapsing under the weight of moral clarity. The people trapped in that cafeteria didn't care about her personal struggles with post-military adjustment or her preference for anonymity. They needed someone with the skills and knowledge to help them survive a situation that exceeded everyone else's training and experience. Through the windows, Sarah could see one of the intruders checking his watch and speaking into his radio with increased urgency. The gesture suggested they were operating according to a specific timeline that would trigger action regardless of external factors like police negotiation or tactical response. Time was running out for intelligence gathering and careful planning. Sarah moved to a position that provided a comprehensive view of the cafeteria and began the kind of tactical analysis that had guided her through successful operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Entry points, sight lines, defensive positions, civilian locations, enemy capabilities, available resources, and risk factors flowed through her consciousness in the prioritized sequence she'd learned during countless mission briefings. The chemistry lab emergency she'd improvised earlier provided potential resources that most people wouldn't recognize as tactically useful. Fire suppression systems could create concealment and confusion. Chemical storage areas contained materials that could be used for distraction or neutralization. Emergency lighting systems could be manipulated to create tactical advantages during close quarters engagement. More importantly, Sarah's knowledge of the building's layout included details that didn't appear on standard floor plans: maintenance corridors, ventilation systems, and structural features that could provide concealed movement routes. Her months of substitute teaching had given her access to areas that most faculty never saw, creating familiarity with the physical environment that could prove crucial for unconventional approach routes. The decision crystallized with the same clarity that had guided her most difficult choices during military service. She couldn't remain passive while innocent people faced trained adversaries who possessed the capability and apparent intention to escalate this situation into tragedy. Her expertise might make the difference between survival and disaster for 30 people who had no idea their quiet substitute teacher possessed skills that could save their lives. But using those skills would require revealing her true identity and accepting consequences that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Sarah Mitchell, substitute teacher, would disappear forever, replaced by the person she'd actually been trained to be. The anonymity that had protected her emotional equilibrium would be gone, along with any possibility of maintaining the careful distance she'd constructed between her military past and her civilian present. The sound of helicopters overhead indicated that media attention was focusing on Riverside High School, which would complicate both law enforcement response and any unconventional actions she might take. Television cameras and news reporting would transform this crisis into public spectacle, eliminating any possibility that her involvement could remain private or unofficial. Sarah checked her improvised equipment one final time: chemistry lab supplies that could create distraction and concealment, emergency tools that could serve as weapons if necessary, and her detailed knowledge of building systems that could provide tactical advantages. It wasn't much compared to the specialized gear she'd used during military operations, but it represented more capability than anyone else possessed in the immediate area. The moment of decision had arrived. She could maintain her concealment and hope that conventional law enforcement response would succeed without casualties, or she could acknowledge that sometimes the person everyone overlooked was exactly the person who could provide solutions that others couldn't see. Sarah Mitchell, substitute teacher and former special operations sniper, prepared to discover whether her carefully constructed civilian identity could survive the moral imperative of saving lives that hung in the balance while trained adversaries implemented plans that conventional response might not be able to counter effectively. The transformation began with Sarah's first step back into the building through the science wing emergency entrance, her civilian persona dissolving as 8 years of special operations training reasserted control over her movements and decision-making processes. The quiet substitute teacher who had graded papers and managed study halls disappeared, replaced by Staff Sergeant Sarah "Ghost" Mitchell, whose tactical expertise had saved American lives in 12 different countries and whose precision under pressure had earned commendations from generals who commanded elite military units. She moved through the familiar hallways with deadly purpose, her senses hyper-alert to every sound and movement while her mind processed tactical variables at the accelerated pace that had kept her alive through 47 combat missions. The building she'd navigated casually for 6 months became a three-dimensional battlefield requiring careful analysis of sight lines, cover positions, and approach routes that could provide advantages against trained adversaries. The chemistry lab yielded improvised resources that most people would never recognize as tactically useful: compounds that could create smoke screens, materials that could generate flashbang effects, and chemicals that could neutralize electronic equipment through controlled reactions. Sarah's military training had included unconventional warfare techniques that emphasized using available resources rather than depending on specialized equipment, skills that proved invaluable when operating in environments that hadn't been designed for combat operations. Her approach to the cafeteria required navigating the main building's corridor system while avoiding detection by intruders who had positioned themselves to monitor obvious routes. Sarah used maintenance spaces and utility corridors that she'd discovered during months of substitute teaching assignments, moving through areas that didn't appear on standard building plans but provided concealed access to critical locations. The ventilation system offered a route that allowed her to reach an observation position directly above the cafeteria, where she could assess the situation with complete accuracy before taking any action that might endanger the hostages. Crawling through ductwork designed for air circulation rather than human movement challenged even her military fitness, but provided intelligence-gathering opportunities that would be impossible through conventional approaches. From her concealed position, Sarah could observe the entire hostage situation with the clarity that had guided her through successful operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. The lead intruder was positioned near the main entrance, controlling access while maintaining communication with external contacts through sophisticated radio equipment. His movements and positioning revealed advanced tactical training that probably included special forces or elite law enforcement background. The second intruder had established an overwatch position that covered the cafeteria's secondary exits, preventing any escape attempts while providing mutual support for his partner. Their coordination demonstrated professional military experience, confirming Sarah's assessment that conventional law enforcement response would face challenges that small-town departments weren't equipped to handle effectively. But Sarah also identified vulnerabilities in their positioning that her special operations training allowed her to recognize and exploit. The intruders had optimized their deployment for controlling hostages and repelling obvious rescue attempts, but they hadn't anticipated threats from concealed positions that required specialized knowledge to access. Her tactical analysis revealed a narrow window of opportunity that would allow her to neutralize both armed intruders without endangering the hostages, but success would require precision timing and marksmanship skills that she hadn't used since her military discharge. The margin for error was essentially zero. Any mistake could result in civilian casualties that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The improvised equipment she'd assembled from chemistry lab supplies would provide the distraction and concealment needed to execute her plan, but the critical factor would be her ability to engage multiple targets with the split-second timing that had earned her the nickname Ghost during combat operations. She hadn't fired a precision shot in 18 months, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Sarah positioned herself at the ventilation grate that provided the optimal angle for her planned engagement, checking her improvised equipment one final time while calculating distances and timing factors that would determine success or failure. The chemistry lab compounds were configured to create maximum confusion and disorientation without causing permanent harm to the hostages, but their effectiveness would depend on precise deployment at exactly the right moment. Through the grate, she could see Emma Chun attempting to comfort younger students while maintaining the kind of leadership that reminded Sarah why some people were naturally suited for positions of responsibility. Tyler Brooks remained alert and ready to respond if opportunities arose, his athletic training evident in the controlled tension of his posture. Linda Rodriguez sat with other faculty members, her expression showing the fear that any rational person would feel in this situation. The sight of these people depending on her expertise for their survival eliminated any remaining doubt about her moral obligations. They had no idea that their quiet substitute teacher possessed capabilities that could save their lives, but Sarah's military training had taught her that some responsibilities couldn't be avoided regardless of personal preferences or emotional comfort. She activated the first phase of her plan by introducing chemical compounds into the building's ventilation system, creating a gradual fog that would build to obscuring levels within approximately 90 seconds. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the intruders would recognize the threat and potentially harm hostages before she could engage. Too late, and law enforcement response might interfere with her operation in ways that increased rather than decreased the danger to innocent people. The fog began building in the cafeteria as Sarah moved to her final position, a maintenance access point that provided direct line of sight to both intruders while remaining concealed from their observation. Her improvised weapons were crude compared to the precision rifle she'd used during military service, but her training had emphasized adapting to available resources rather than depending on optimal equipment. When the fog reached sufficient density to provide concealment, Sarah implemented the second phase of her plan by creating a controlled explosion in the chemistry lab that drew the attention of both intruders while masking the sound of her movement into the cafeteria. The distraction worked exactly as intended, causing both armed men to momentarily shift their focus away from the hostages and toward the unexpected noise from another part of the building. The engagement lasted less than 6 seconds. Sarah's first shot eliminated the lead intruder before he could react to her presence, while her second shot neutralized his partner before the man could bring his weapon to bear on the hostages. The precision and timing that had saved American lives in combat zones proved equally effective in protecting innocent civilians from trained adversaries who had underestimated the threats they might face. The sudden silence that followed the engagement was broken by confused voices from hostages who couldn't see clearly through the dissipating fog, but recognized that the immediate threat had somehow been eliminated. Sarah remained in concealment, while assessing the situation for additional threats, her training requiring confirmation that all adversaries had been neutralized before exposing herself to potential counterattack. "Everyone remain calm and stay where you are," Sarah called out, her voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect from elite soldiers during the most dangerous missions of her military career. "The immediate threat has been eliminated, but we need to ensure the building is completely secure before anyone moves." Emma Chun's voice cut through the confusion with characteristic leadership. "Is that Ms. Mitchell?" "Sarah, what just happened? How did you get in here?" The question forced Sarah to confront the reality that her carefully maintained anonymity was gone forever. Everyone in the cafeteria had heard her voice during the engagement, and they would soon see her emerging from concealment with equipment and capabilities that couldn't be explained by substitute teaching experience. The quiet, unremarkable educator they thought they knew was about to be revealed as someone entirely different. "Yes, it's Sarah Mitchell," she replied, moving carefully through the dissipating fog, while maintaining alertness for additional threats. I'm going to need everyone to follow my instructions exactly until law enforcement can secure the building. There may be additional intruders, and we need to maintain security protocols until we're certain the threat has been completely eliminated. Dr. Hayes struggled to process what he was witnessing as Sarah emerged from concealment, carrying improvised weapons and moving with the fluid precision of someone who had received advanced tactical training. The principal's understanding of his substitute teacher had been completely shattered by observing capabilities that suggested military or law enforcement background far beyond anything indicated in her employment records. "Sarah, I don't understand what just happened," Has said, his voice reflecting the confusion that affected everyone who was trying to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the individual who had just neutralized armed intruders using skills that seemed impossible for a civilian educator to possess. "I'll explain everything once we're secure," Sarah replied, checking the intruder's equipment and confirming that their radio communications had been monitoring law enforcement response. "Right now, we need to focus on getting everyone to safety and ensuring there are no additional threats in the building." Tyler Brooks approached her position with the kind of respectful attention that athletes showed coaches who had earned their trust through demonstrated competence. "Miss Mitchell, that was incredible. How did you know how to do that? Are you some kind of police officer or something?" The question highlighted the magnitude of revelation that awaited everyone who thought they understood Sarah's background and capabilities. She wasn't a police officer. She was something far more specialized and dangerous. Someone whose training exceeded most law enforcement and rivaled elite military units that most civilians never knew existed. "I had some training before I became a teacher," Sarah replied, using the same careful phrasing she'd employed with Linda Rodriguez earlier. "Right now, the important thing is making sure everyone gets medical attention if needed, and that we can provide accurate information to law enforcement about what happened here." Through the cafeteria windows, Sarah could see the law enforcement response transitioning from crisis management to crime scene investigation as officers recognized that the immediate threat had been eliminated. Sheriff's Department personnel were establishing secure perimeters while preparing to enter the building and assess the situation, but their approach remained cautious due to uncertainty about how the threat had been neutralized. Emma Chun moved to Sarah's position with the kind of direct attention that characterized her approach to challenging situations. "Ms. Mitchell, I've been in your classes for 3 months, and I've never seen anything that suggested you could handle armed intruders like some kind of special forces soldier. What aren't you telling us about your background?" The question forced Sarah to confront the fundamental deception she'd maintained for 6 months while trying to blend into civilian life. Everyone at Riverside High School knew exactly what she'd allowed them to know: a quiet, competent substitute teacher who handled difficult assignments effectively but remained unremarkable in ways that avoided uncomfortable attention. None of them suspected that she'd commanded respect from elite soldiers, that her tactical judgment had been trusted in life-or-death situations, or that her marksmanship skills had been considered among the best in special operations. The gap between her public identity and her actual capabilities was about to become public knowledge in ways that would change her life forever. "My military service included specialized training that proved useful in this situation," Sarah replied, providing the minimum explanation that honesty required while avoiding details that might compromise ongoing law enforcement investigation. "The important thing is that everyone is safe and that we can help authorities understand what happened here." Linda Rodriguez joined the group surrounding Sarah, her expression showing gratitude mixed with amazement at discovering capabilities in her colleague that she'd never suspected. "Sarah, you saved our lives. Whatever training you had, whatever your background might be, you put yourself at risk to protect people who had no idea you possessed these kinds of skills." The recognition was both gratifying and troubling for Sarah, who had spent 6 months trying to avoid exactly this kind of attention and acknowledgement. She'd chosen substitute teaching specifically because it allowed her to contribute without attracting notice that might lead to questions about her military service or expectations that she couldn't meet in civilian environments. Now faced with the aftermath of using her expertise to save lives, Sarah realized that her careful anonymity was gone forever. Everyone at Riverside High School would know that their quiet substitute teacher possessed capabilities that exceeded their understanding, and the revelation would inevitably spread throughout the small community of Cedar Falls. The sound of law enforcement officers entering the building indicated that professional response was finally reaching the crisis scene. But Sarah knew that their questions would be far more complex than standard witness interviews. Sheriff's Department personnel would need to understand how a substitute teacher had neutralized trained adversaries, using equipment and tactics that suggested military background far beyond anything indicated in employment records. Dr. Marcus Thompson, the superintendent, would demand explanations about how someone with undisclosed combat training had been working in his schools for 6 months. The school board would require detailed background investigation to ensure that Sarah's military service didn't include factors that might affect her suitability for educational work. Parents would want assurance that their children had been taught by someone whose qualifications matched district standards. But the most challenging questions would come from colleagues and students who had to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the individual who had just demonstrated capabilities that seemed impossible for civilian educators to possess. Sarah's carefully constructed identity as an unremarkable substitute teacher had been permanently destroyed by the moral necessity of saving lives that hung in the balance. Sheriff Patricia Williams entered the cafeteria with the cautious professionalism that characterized law enforcement response to situations involving civilian casualties and neutralized threats. Her experienced eye immediately recognized that the scene had been controlled by someone with advanced tactical training, but the identity of that person challenged everything she thought she understood about the residents of Cedar Falls. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm going to need a comprehensive statement about what happened here," Sheriff Williams said, her tone reflecting respect for someone who had clearly possessed the expertise to handle a situation that might have overwhelmed conventional response. "Your actions saved lives today, but we need to understand your background and training to complete our investigation properly." The request marked the beginning of a process that would inevitably expose every aspect of Sarah's military service and force her to confront the person she'd been trying to become versus the person she'd actually been trained to be. The quiet substitute teacher who graded papers and managed study halls was gone forever, replaced by someone whose capabilities would be public knowledge throughout Cedar Falls and beyond. Emma Chen approached Sarah one final time as law enforcement began organizing witness interviews and crime scene documentation. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that whatever your background might be, you're the bravest person I've ever met. You risked everything to protect people who had no idea you possessed the skills to help them." The comment crystallized the moral complexity that would define Sarah's future in Cedar Falls. She had used her expertise to save innocent lives, proving that sometimes the person everyone overlooked was exactly the person who could provide solutions that others couldn't see. But that revelation would require her to abandon the anonymity that had protected her emotional equilibrium and accept a public identity that matched her actual capabilities. 3 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell stood in the main conference room of the Cedar Falls Community Center, facing a packed auditorium of parents, students, faculty, and community members who had gathered to hear her explain how a substitute teacher had possessed the training needed to neutralize armed intruders and save 30 innocent lives. The room buzzed with conversations about the dramatic events at Riverside High School and speculation about Sarah's military background, which had been partially revealed through news reports and law enforcement statements. Everyone knew that their quiet substitute teacher was actually a decorated special operations veteran, but the details of her service and the circumstances that brought her to civilian teaching remained subjects of intense curiosity. Dr. Robert Hayes introduced Sarah with obvious pride and respect, acknowledging that her actions had prevented a tragedy that could have devastated the entire community. The principal's understanding of his substitute teacher had been completely transformed by discovering capabilities that exceeded anything he'd imagined possible from civilian educators. 6 months ago, we hired Sarah Mitchell as a substitute teacher, Hayes began, addressing the crowd that filled every seat and lined the walls of the community center. We thought we were getting someone who could manage classrooms and grade papers effectively. What we actually got was a hero whose training and expertise saved the lives of students and faculty, who had no idea they were protected by someone with extraordinary capabilities. Sarah approached the podium with the same calm professionalism that had characterized her military service, but she also felt the weight of public attention that she'd spent 6 months trying to avoid. The audience included parents of students whose lives she'd saved, faculty members who had worked alongside her without knowing her background, and community leaders who were trying to understand how someone with her qualifications had remained anonymous for so long. For 8 years, I served in the United States Army Special Operations, Sarah began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect from elite soldiers during the most dangerous missions of her military career. My service included multiple combat deployments and specialized training in tactical operations, precision marksmanship, and hostage rescue procedures. The audience listened with rapt attention as Sarah explained her transition from military service to civilian teaching, describing the challenges of adapting elite combat skills to educational environments that seemed to have no connection to her previous experience. She spoke about choosing substitute teaching because it allowed her to contribute to society while maintaining the anonymity that helped her process the emotional complexities of post-military adjustment. I never intended to use my military training in civilian environments, Sarah continued, making eye contact with parents whose children had been among the hostages. But when I saw students and colleagues facing trained adversaries who could have escalated the situation into tragedy, I couldn't remain passive while people I cared about were in danger. Emma Chen, who had been invited to speak about her experience during the crisis, approached the podium with the confidence that had characterized her leadership during the hostage situation. Her remarks focused on Sarah's courage and the expertise that had saved lives when conventional response might have arrived too late to prevent casualties. Miss Mitchell risked everything to protect people who had no idea she possessed the skills to help them, Emma said, addressing the crowd with the articulate intelligence that made her a natural leader among her peers. She could have remained hidden and hoped that law enforcement would handle the situation, but instead she chose to act when she realized that waiting might cost lives. Tyler Brooks followed Emma to the podium, his remarks reflecting the respect that athletes showed coaches who had earned their trust through demonstrated competence. His comments highlighted Sarah's dedication to students during her months of substitute teaching, noting that her military background had never interfered with her effectiveness as an educator. Ms. Mitchell treated us with respect and challenged us to think critically about everything we studied, Tyler said, his voice carrying genuine gratitude for someone who had influenced his academic development. She never made us feel like we were just temporary assignments or that our work didn't matter because she was a substitute teacher. Dr. Marcus Thompson, the superintendent, concluded the community meeting by announcing that Sarah had been offered a permanent position as head of Riverside High School's new crisis management and emergency preparedness program. The position would utilize her specialized training while allowing her to continue contributing to educational excellence that had characterized her substitute teaching assignments. Sarah Mitchell represents the best of what we hope to find in educational professionals, Thompson declared, addressing the crowd that had been transformed from curiosity seekers into genuine admirers of someone who had proven that extraordinary capabilities could be found in unexpected places. Her expertise saved lives, but her dedication to students and commitment to educational excellence make her exactly the kind of teacher we want working with our children. The applause that followed reflected genuine appreciation for someone who had demonstrated that sometimes the person everyone overlooked was exactly the person who could provide solutions that others couldn't see. Sarah's carefully constructed anonymity was gone forever, but it had been replaced by recognition and respect that matched her actual contributions to the community. 6 months after the crisis at Riverside High School, Sarah Mitchell stood in her new office overlooking the main courtyard where students gathered between classes. Her official title now reflecting the expertise that had remained hidden during her months as a substitute teacher. The quiet educator who had graded papers and managed study halls had evolved into someone whose capabilities were recognized and valued by everyone who worked alongside her. The transformation hadn't been easy, requiring her to confront aspects of her military service that she'd preferred to keep private, while adapting specialized training to educational environments that benefited from security expertise. But the work felt meaningful in ways that reminded her why service mattered. Whether in combat zones or civilian schools where young people deserved protection and guidance from adults who possessed the skills to provide both. Through her window, Sarah could see Emma Chun leading a group discussion about college preparation strategies, her natural leadership abilities evident in the way she organized her peers and facilitated productive conversations. Tyler Brooks was working with younger students on athletic training programs that emphasized discipline and teamwork, his own development reflecting the positive influence of adults who had taken his potential seriously. The sight of these young people thriving in environments that had been secured through her expertise reminded Sarah that sometimes the most important battles were fought not in distant countries, but in small communities where ordinary people accomplished extraordinary things when circumstances required courage and competence that exceeded normal expectations. Sarah Mitchell had started as a substitute teacher holding a clipboard, dismissed by people who couldn't see past their assumptions about temporary employees and unremarkable credentials. She had become a respected professional whose training and expertise were valued by everyone who understood that extraordinary capabilities could be found in the most unexpected places, ready to emerge when moral clarity demanded action that others couldn't provide. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Sarah's new office at the Department of Education in Helena, Montana, illuminating the stack of policy documents that would reshape emergency preparedness protocols in schools across the entire state. 2 years had passed since the crisis at Riverside High School, and the ripple effects of that October afternoon continued to transform educational security practices throughout the region and beyond. The official title on her door read, Director of School Crisis Management and Emergency Response, but Sarah understood that her real role was teaching administrators and faculty how to recognize threats that conventional training hadn't prepared them to handle. The expertise that had remained hidden during her months as a substitute teacher was now being systematized into comprehensive programs that could protect students and staff in districts that might never face armed intruders but needed preparation for emergencies that exceeded normal administrative capabilities. Her morning briefing included reports from 17 different school districts that had implemented the Mitchell Protocol, named after the tactical response procedure she developed based on her special operations background and her intimate understanding of educational environments. The protocol emphasized early threat recognition, coordinated response strategies, and communication systems that could function effectively when conventional authority structures became overwhelmed by crisis situations. The success stories were gratifying but also sobering reminders of how many potential tragedies had been prevented through preparation that most people would never know about. A middle school in Billings had identified and neutralized a planned attack through threat assessment procedures that Sarah had designed. A high school in Missoula had executed perfect evacuation protocols during a chemical spill that could have caused mass casualties without proper coordination. An elementary school in Bozeman had managed a medical emergency that saved a child's life through crisis response training that Sarah's program had provided. Each successful implementation validated Sarah's belief that extraordinary capabilities could be systematized and taught to ordinary people who found themselves facing extraordinary situations. The specialized knowledge that had seemed irrelevant to civilian life was proving invaluable when applied to protecting environments, where children learned and teachers worked without expecting to need tactical expertise. Dr. Amanda Foster, the State Superintendent of Education, entered Sarah's office carrying a folder of documents that represented the next phase of expanding crisis management protocols to neighboring states. The partnership with Colorado, Wyoming, and North Dakota would create a regional network of schools prepared for threats that transcended traditional security measures and required innovative approaches based on military-grade tactical thinking. The Federal Education Committee wants to review your protocols for potential national implementation, Dr. Foster announced, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk with the expression of someone who had learned to appreciate expertise that existed outside conventional educational backgrounds. Apparently, several incidents in other states could have been prevented if administrators had access to the kind of training you've developed. The possibility of national influence was both exciting and daunting for Sarah, who had spent months learning to adapt specialized military knowledge to civilian environments that operated according to entirely different principles and priorities. Educational bureaucracy moved slowly and emphasized consensus building rather than rapid decision-making, while her tactical training emphasized swift assessment and immediate action based on available intelligence. But the collaboration had proven beneficial for both perspectives. Sarah's crisis management protocols incorporated educational expertise about child psychology, administrative procedures, and community relations that made tactical responses more effective and less traumatic for students who might experience emergency situations. The synthesis of military precision with educational sensitivity created comprehensive programs that protected young people while maintaining them supportive environments that characterized effective schools. Emma Chun appeared in the doorway of Sarah's office, now wearing the professional attire of someone who had graduated from Riverside High School with a full scholarship to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Emma's academic excellence had been recognized by admissions committees who valued her leadership during the hostage crisis and her subsequent work with school security initiatives that Sarah had mentored. Colonel Mitchell, Emma said, using the rank that Sarah had been offered when the Pentagon recruited her to develop crisis management protocols for military families and defense contractor schools. I wanted to thank you again for the recommendation letter that helped secure my appointment to West Point. Your support made the difference in my acceptance. The title still felt strange to Sarah, who had declined the military commission in favor of civilian work that seemed more aligned with her personal values and professional goals. But the recognition from both educational and military authorities validated her belief that specialized expertise could create value in unexpected contexts when properly applied to genuine needs. Emma's success represented the broader impact that Sarah's work was having on young people who had witnessed extraordinary events and been inspired to pursue careers that could help others facing similar challenges. Tyler Brooks had enrolled in law enforcement training with the goal of becoming a tactical officer who could bridge the gap between civilian protection and military expertise. Several other students from Riverside had chosen careers in emergency services, inspired by seeing how specialized knowledge could make the difference between tragedy and survival. The transformation extended beyond individual career choices. to systemic changes in how communities approached safety and preparedness. Cedar Falls had become a model for small-town emergency response, with training programs that prepared local law enforcement, medical personnel, and civic leaders for crisis situations that exceeded their normal experience and capabilities. Sheriff Patricia Williams had implemented tactical training that incorporated military-style coordination with civilian emergency response, creating a hybrid approach that proved effective during natural disasters and public safety incidents that required rapid decision-making under pressure. The program attracted attention from law enforcement agencies throughout Montana and neighboring states, leading to partnerships that enhanced regional security capabilities. Dr. Robert Hayes had been promoted to superintendent of a larger district in Colorado, where he was implementing comprehensive crisis management protocols based on lessons learned during the Riverside incident. His experience working with Sarah had convinced him that educational leadership required preparation for extraordinary situations that couldn't be anticipated through conventional administrative training. The ripple effects continued to expand. As more districts recognized the value of incorporating tactical expertise into the value of incorporating tactical expertise into educational environments that had previously operated under the assumption that dangerous situations were rare enough to ignore. Sarah's protocols were being adapted for urban schools facing gang violence, rural districts concerned about natural disasters, and suburban communities where the illusion of safety had been shattered by national incidents that demonstrated the vulnerability of supposedly secure environments. Linda Rodriguez had become the head librarian at a university in Oregon, where she was developing information resources that supported emergency preparedness education and research into crisis management techniques. Her experience during the hostage situation had convinced her that libraries could serve as critical resources during emergency situations, providing communication hubs and information access that supported community response efforts. The professional recognition was gratifying, but Sarah's greatest satisfaction came from the knowledge that her work was creating lasting change in how society protected its most vulnerable members. Children attending schools that implemented her protocols were safer not because they lived in fear, but because adults around them possessed the knowledge and training needed to respond effectively when ordinary situations became extraordinary. The personal cost had been significant. Sarah's anonymity was gone forever, replaced by public recognition that brought both opportunities and obligations she hadn't anticipated. Media attention focused on her military background and the dramatic nature of the Riverside incident, creating public expectations that sometimes conflicted with her preference for systematic, behind-the-scenes work that avoided sensationalism. But the relationships she'd developed with colleagues and students provided compensation for the loss of privacy. Emma Chun's success at West Point vindicated Sarah's belief in recognizing potential that others might overlook. Tyler Brooks' dedication to law enforcement training demonstrated that young people could be inspired by witnessing competence and courage under pressure. The professional respect she'd earned from educators and administrators proved that expertise could be valued regardless of its unconventional origins. The office walls displayed certificates and commendations that reflected recognition from both military and civilian authorities, but Sarah's attention was drawn to the photographs of students and colleagues whose lives had been changed by events. That began with a substitute teacher holding a clipboard in an empty classroom, Emma Chun receiving her West Point appointment, Tyler Brooks graduating from the police academy, Linda Rodriguez being honored for innovative library services, Dr. Hayes accepting his superintendent position. Each image represented proof that extraordinary circumstances could reveal extraordinary capabilities in ordinary people who found themselves facing challenges that exceeded their normal experience. Sarah's military training had provided the specific skills needed to neutralize armed intruders, but the broader lesson was about recognizing and developing potential that existed in unexpected places and might remain hidden until crisis situations demanded action that others couldn't provide. The intercom on Sarah's desk announced her next appointment, a video conference with federal education officials who were considering national implementation of crisis management protocols that had proven successful in Montana. The conversation would focus on adapting specialized tactical knowledge to diverse educational environments across the country, creating comprehensive programs that could protect students and staff regardless of their geographic location or community. Characteristics. As Sarah prepared for the meeting, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a dismissed substitute teacher into a recognized expert whose work was influencing policy at national levels. The path had required confronting aspects of her identity that she'd preferred to keep private, accepting public attention that challenged her emotional comfort, and adapting military expertise to civilian environments that operated according to different principles and priorities. But the work felt meaningful in ways that validated her transition from military service to civilian contribution. The skills that had once been used to eliminate threats in foreign countries were now protecting American children in their own communities. The tactical knowledge that had seemed irrelevant to educational environments was proving invaluable when applied to securing spaces where young people learned and grew without expecting to need protection from trained adversaries. Sarah Mitchell had proved that sometimes the person everyone overlooked was exactly the person who could see solutions that others couldn't perceive. Her story would be remembered not just as a dramatic rescue, but as an example of how extraordinary capabilities could emerge from ordinary circumstances when moral clarity demanded action that conventional responses couldn't provide. The legacy continued to unfold as more communities implemented protocols that reflected the synthesis of military expertise with educational wisdom, creating comprehensive programs that protected vulnerable populations while maintaining the supportive environments that characterized effective learning. Her work demonstrated that specialized knowledge could create lasting value when applied to genuine needs, regardless of how unconventional the source might appear to conventional authorities. Years later, educators throughout the country would implement crisis management procedures without knowing that their foundation had been laid by a substitute teacher who had once been dismissed as temporary help, whose expertise had remained hidden until circumstances demanded capabilities that exceeded everyone's expectations and assumptions about what was possible from seemingly ordinary people. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.